Welcome, everyone. This is my privilege to host Caity Kelly, who is an alumnus of our Instructional Systems and Learning Technologies Master's Program, and she serves as the Assistant Director for the Florida State University Program for Instructional Excellence and the Fellow Society. And so I know that Caity's going to tell us a little bit about that program, and then she will talk about training and reflections, a continuous process of analysis, improvement for quality instructional design. So Caity, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klein, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I see a lot of familiar names in the Zoom registration and in the list today, so I really appreciate all of you being here. I'm going to take just a moment to share my screen here. All right, so as Dr. Klein mentioned, we're going to be talking about training reflections today, specifically how to continuously analyze and improve our instructional design to ensure that we create a quality instructional intervention, performance support, and other types of content. So again, my name is Caity, and I am the Assistant Director for the Program for Instructional Excellence and the Fellow Society. I actually started here at Florida State by getting my bachelor's degree in psychology. And then when I was done with that, I went right across the street to the Stone Building and pursued my master's in instructional system and learning technologies. I also have experience in tutoring, teaching, instructional design, event planning, mentorship, etc. So that is where a lot of my experience focuses on in the field of ISLT. You can see all of my information here if you ever need to contact me at the Program for Instructional Excellence or the Fellow Society. But I kind of wanted to start things off by telling the story of my very first ASKe conference. This would have been, I believe it was the spring semester of 2018. I was finishing up my bachelor's degree in psychology, and I was actually a prospective student for ISLT. I had not yet joined the program or taken any classes, but I decided to attend the ASKe conference, which was in person at the time, and just get to know some of the students and the alumni and faculty from the program. And everyone made me feel so welcome. I thought it was such a very cool field, so many interesting topics in education, and a lot of with some of the learning theories that I had already studied in psychology as well. So yeah, it was a wonderful experience. So I'm very happy to be coming back as an alumnus today. All right, so to give everybody an idea of the structure of today's session, we are going to be going over two case studies, one that is a little bit larger of a project that I spearheaded for my program, and one that is a little bit shorter that I also sort of took the lead on and had a lot of help from the rest of my team in the PI program. We'll talk specifically about tips I learned, as well as some design mistakes that I discovered, such as what strengths did we retain in our projects and our trainings for future events, and what areas did we decide to revise and improve based on audience feedback. Additionally, what specific instructional design strategies were helpful throughout the training development process. Having the background in instructional design really has helped me tremendously in this position, and we've been able to make so many helpful changes and updates to the PI training. So it's really been a great experience. But while we go through this content today, although we're specifically focusing on training that is in the field of academia, there are a lot of tips and experiences and stories that I think you can apply to all different types of industries and areas of ISLT. So just be sure to reflect on your own interests in this field and think about how what I'm talking about today can apply to what you would like to do in your field. So to go over a few key takeaways in today's session, we will explore topics such as examining the ADDIE process in action, and specifically, as I mentioned, this will be in an academia-focused field, specifically teaching assistant or TA training and professional development resources. We'll talk about identifying our subject matter experts and other key resources for making sure that all of our content is relevant and helpful for the trainees. Collecting training content when time, funding, and other resources are limited, as well as making design decisions when those types of resources are limited. This can be something that is very, very challenging. And I have a few examples of working under those conditions and how we were still able to create quality content for our training. We'll talk about pinpointing relevant feedback for not only making improvements to our training and our other instructional interventions, but also for determining what are the core strengths and what should we maintain in future iterations of the training. And lastly, I'll take a few moments to outline the Program for Instructional Excellence resources, events, and services that any of you who are current graduate students might find helpful as you go throughout your graduate school experience at FSU. So, a little bit of background about the Program for Instructional Excellence, also known as PI. I actually came into the instructional Program for Instructional Excellence as a graduate student in my final semester in the ISLT program. I served as the graduate assistant. So a lot of the work that I did, of course, there were fewer hours in the week, but I started a lot of the instructional design projects and updates when I was in that role. Once I graduated, we went through the summer semester. I came back to FSU as a guest speaker for different professional development events a few times. And then in fall of that year, I came back and was hired as the assistant director for this program. So on this slide, I've listed the definition of the Program for Instructional Excellence that is on our website. I won't read through the whole thing, but just to give you a quick idea of our mission, the Program for Instructional Excellence, a unit of the graduate school, strives to enrich the learning experience for undergraduate students at FSU by supporting the teaching efforts of graduate student teaching assistants through its various services. And I always like to highlight this particular part of the goals and the mission statement because it does a good job, I think, of illustrating the effect that ensuring these TAs are properly trained has, because it's not only affecting their experience as a teaching assistant, as an instructor at the university, but it's also affecting the educational experience of, potentially thousands of undergraduates. So that's something we always keep in mind. It's something that always motivates us to, again, continue reflecting on and analyzing all of our training and our other resources, events, and constantly making improvements so that we can further enrich the educational experience for our undergraduates. To give you an idea of some of the things we offer through the Program for Instructional Excellence, the main thing that we are known for is mandatory TA training. And I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that in the next slide. We also conduct teaching topic workshops throughout the semester in spring, summer, and fall. These workshops are often based on needs assessment data that I collect typically on an annual basis. I will create a needs assessment that gauges what TAs in different departments feel is lacking, where there are gaps in their departmental TA support resources, as well as the trainings that their unique departments offer. Based on those gaps, we're then able to bring in experts, different speakers throughout the university to talk about the topics that they would like more education on. So that's one thing we do frequently throughout the year. We also have other miscellaneous free resources and services for instructors. These include things such as templates that they can use in their classes, job aids, how-to guides, instructional videos. We also do various services that instructors at FSU can take advantage of. So one thing to note about our program is that the main staff who work for the Program for Instructional Excellence, it's me, the program director, Dr. Lisa Laceno. We usually have a graduate assistant who helps us with a lot of the administrative side of things. And then we have a team of about 12 to 15 graduate student teaching assistants who are referred to as our PI associates. And I bring them into the story today because they are a very key sort of asset when it comes to how we delegate and how we try to reach as many departments at the university as possible. The PI associates are experienced teaching assistants. They are all from different programs across the university. So they typically will come to me and to the director of the program with the needs for their specific department based on their own needs assessments. They'll tell us what that department needs, and then we work together on how to close those gaps between optimal performance and current performance. So they help us with so many of these services. They help to moderate and facilitate the training, but they also do things such as peer observations of teaching. If you are currently a TA, you can request one of our PI associates to come into your classroom. They will observe your teaching and then provide you with personalized feedback on what you're doing well and what you can improve. And again, that's just one of the resources that they help us with through PI. There are many things that we can offer to help enrich your experience as an instructor. So with the introduction of the program out of the way, I'd like to dive into our first major case study of today's session. Now, before I talk about this specific project, I first need to sort of go back a little bit and explain how the TA process works at FSU. So at Florida State, there are different categories of TAs. There's category 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the new one, which is category 5. These categories determine essentially what your level of responsibility is as a TA, how much you will be interacting with students, etc. Because you may know based on your own experience as a student that you have some TAs who are responsible mainly for grading or for running labs or recitation sessions for different courses, while others are the instructor of record and they essentially teach the entire course with a faculty member, supervisor assisting. So that is what determines what category your specific role as a TA falls into. But back in fall of 2021, the FSU Faculty Senate determined that it was necessary to implement a new category for TAs, and that is category 5. So the category 5 TA is a TA who assists with graduate level courses. So it is a graduate student TA who is assisting with courses that are at the graduate level. Now, because of this brand new designation, it was important to create a new training to go along with that. And that is because teaching in a graduate level classroom can be very, very different when you compare that to teaching in an undergraduate level classroom. To give you an idea of what the standard training we have covers, the standard training for categories 1 through 4, it is a 2-day session, which is currently conducted on Zoom, where TAs go through topics such as core FSU policies, like FERPA, the academic honor policy, ADA, human resources, those sort of very important logistical details for their work as an instructor at FSU. They also go through basics of teaching with Florida State Tech, so they'll be taught how to use Canvas and various tools they can use for their teaching there. They're also taught about ensuring that they are conducting a classroom that supports inclusion. And then on the second day, they typically go through more information about ADA. We've started incorporating universal design for learning into our training curriculum. That has been very helpful to the TAs to ensure that they have accessible classrooms. And then we also have a section on active learning across disciplines where they can learn about how to use more sort of engaging teaching strategies. So that is what our standard training covers. But for the category 5, again, it's a very, very different context that the TAs are operating in. So one thing that can be a little bit challenging about creating training for teaching assistants is that depending on what department you're in, the way that the class functions and the responsibilities that you are expected to take on as a TA can be very, very different. So because of that, we try to take a bit of a general approach, things that all instructors need to know, but then we also try to personalize a little bit. So for example, when I first came into the program, one of the sessions was a very general topic on engaging learning practices. And we were receiving a lot of feedback from individuals, for example, in the STEM field who didn't find any of the tips particularly relevant to their specific field. So with feedback like that, we're continuously trying to analyze and improve and come up with solutions. And for that one, we replaced that session with the active learning across disciplines panel. So instead of having one person talk about general strategies for engaging learners, we have representatives from very, very different departments, usually from STEM, from fine arts, from humanities and writing fields come in, and they share their active learning techniques for their specific fields. So that's an example of something that is a challenge that we have based on continuously analyzing our feedback and reflecting on what we can do, how can we can be better, that has yielded a lot more success within the program. But going back to the Category 5 TA training, this was something that we were called upon to do in fall 2021. At first, the program director was going to spearhead this project, but eventually we realized that we had so many things going on, and since I had the instructional design experience, I was asked to spearhead the project instead, and I was very, very excited to do so. So one thing that was a major constraint with this project is that we had a very, very short timeline when we were told we needed to develop this new training. I believe it was a little bit over a month. And this is something that was literally from the ground up. We had no previous training content to begin with. It was going to be developed entirely from scratch. One thing that helped me tremendously when I began this project was utilizing an instructional design model, specifically ASKe, because it kept me on track. It helped me figure out what I needed to do and what phases I need to go through and how to organize all of the work I was doing and the timeline for this project. And I think that high transfer, which is of course the idea that the content you're teaching your learners transfers directly to the workplace. It's skills and knowledge, skills and abilities that are completely relevant to your target audience. That should always be a goal when you're designing instructional interventions. But for this, it definitely felt even more pressing because the trainees had already been through that standard training that we offer. And here we were offering a new, more advanced training. So how were we going to make sure that this was relevant to them, that it didn't feel like they were repeating things that they had already learned in the standard training? So throughout the whole process, this was always the goal, was constantly going back to what specific things can we teach them that are going to go directly from this training into their jobs as TAs. So as I mentioned, using the ASKe model was how I kept myself on track with this project. Just in case we do have any new ISLT students in here, the ASKe model, of course, stands for Analyze, Design, Develop, Implement, and Evaluate. And this is a process that you're constantly thinking about how each piece will affect the rest of your project. So starting out with the analysis phase, of course, we considered our target audience, which, as I mentioned, are the Category 5 TAs, the TAs who are assisting specifically with graduate level courses. We determined who our subject matter experts would be pretty early on because we knew that this would help us determine where we were going to get our content and what content we needed to cover. We determined our learning outcomes. And again, as I mentioned, high transfer was so very important to make sure that this training was worthwhile and was especially helpful for this brand new Category 5 label, essentially. And then the timeline was something that was, again, pretty short that we had to deal with. And that sort of links to our constraints on the slide. The timeline was, as I mentioned, a little bit over a month. So using this process and this model was very helpful for making sure that we did everything we needed to do and produce something that was a high quality training. The delivery options, we really only had one, and that was online. However, we had other things that we needed to consider regarding delivery. Were we going to make the training asynchronous? Was it going to be completely synchronous on Zoom? Was it going to be a combination of the two? And ultimately, we did decide that it would be best to have the training be asynchronous, because the standard training that the TAs would have already gone through is a little bit of a mixture. It has some asynchronous components and some synchronous components. So because of that, we knew that a lot of this training could be self-guided, and we could have various channels for Q&A and other support services if the trainees needed to interact in real time with one of our staff. Another constraint that we had to work with, aside from the small timeline, was we didn't really have any funding for the project. It was entirely dependent on FSU resources that we already had access to, as well as collaborations with some of our colleagues. But we did find a lot of solutions that still allowed us to carry forth with good quality content. So moving on to the design phase, and this of course is where things got really, really exciting. The first thing that we focused on was the learning objectives. What did we want students to walk away from this training having learned? What are these measurable, observable skills that we want them to demonstrate as Category 5 TAs? And we determined a few of these. Actually, later in the presentation, you'll get to actually see what the training looks like and what specific goals we had them pursue. But to give you a little bit of an idea of what these learning objectives entailed, we decided that major takeaways should be basic understanding of core FSU policies and ensuring that they knew which offices were associated with which policies. Now, this was something that we designed very carefully because, again, the trainees would have already been through the standard training where they focus on this topic in depth. However, we did want to ensure that this was something they were fully cognizant of in their Category 5 role that they remembered. So we made a lot of that content optional for them to review as needed in order to complete the assessments for the module. So that was one topic. Another major goal that we wanted them to walk away from the training having learned was conflicts of interest. In the Category 5 TA designation, you are in the graduate level classroom. So you are a graduate student teaching or assisting rather in a graduate level course. This is something that can sometimes pose challenges because you may find that you know some of the students in your course, maybe some of them you've had classes with previously. So because of that, it was very important for us to ensure that TAs departed from the training knowing how to identify real conflicts of interest and what steps to take to mitigate the challenge whenever that happened. Another goal that we wanted TAs to walk away with was communication and professionalism in the Category 5 TA training scenario. So specifically by that, we mean we wanted them to know how to communicate professionally and objectively, both in text and when speaking to other students. Again, compared to the undergraduate level classroom, this can feel a little bit tricky. Sometimes in the graduate level classroom, when you are also a graduate student, you may be feeling some imposter syndrome come in. That's something that I've talked to a lot of TAs that sometimes when they first come in, they feel like, you know, I'm not meant to be here, I'm not qualified. And we always remind them that you were chosen for this position by a faculty member who saw your skill and who saw how wonderful you are with this content. So giving them those skills to determine how to remain professional and how to communicate effectively with graduate students who may be their peers was very, very important for this training. Additionally, we also showed them how to set boundaries. Sometimes, again, if you know the students in your classroom fairly well as the Category 5 TA, it's important to know how to set those boundaries between your peers and then you being a TA in their classroom. And then lastly, we wanted students to reflect on some of the practical tips from experienced TAs. We had some of the PI associates that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation created a list of videos for us. And in each video, they went through their own experiences and practical tips they had learned in the classroom. The Category 5 trainees were then given the opportunity to choose which ones they felt were most relevant to them, watch those videos, and then reflect on how they can use the tips and techniques shared in those videos for their own roles. As I mentioned previously, it is very challenging to find something that suits every single field and every single type of TA there is across so many colleges at the university. And this is why a major goal that we have been developing in our training is to get them to reflect. How can they take what they're learning in this training and mold it to their specific role? So in addition to the learning objectives, the assessments and developing those, they sort of went hand in hand with one another. Now, of course, given the short timeline and the short deadline TAs had to work with to complete this training, we couldn't create anything that was overly complex, that was too high up in cognition in Bloom's taxonomy, if you will. So we mainly focused our assessments on short write-ups, discussion board posts, and then we utilized some of the automatically graded quizzes that are within the Canvas learning management system. And specifically with those assessments, because we did want them to be able to perform at a higher level than simply memorizing information, the assessment questions were designed very specifically to assess core facts that they might need to know about various aspects of being a TA. So that was things such as what is FERPA? Other things like what is ADA? What is the Office of Accessibility Services? Why are they important? So different core facts like that were assessed in the quizzes, but we also created quiz questions that essentially were designed to ensure that the TAs had at least opened and looked through the materials within the Canvas course. Now, a lot of the materials that we decided we would design into the training are actually job aids that they can take, they can print them out or use digital versions and bring them directly into their classroom. Again, as I mentioned, we were always thinking about transfer, and we knew that rather than having them focus on doing activities that would stay specifically grounded to the training, we wanted them to actually take these materials and use them beyond the training, things that were specifically useful and transferable to the real workplace. So again, the quiz questions, aside from those core facts, were also designed to motivate them to open these documents, look through them, and learn how they could use them in the workplace. When we were planning our content upon solidifying our learning objectives and our plan for assessments, I actually purposefully overestimated how much content we would need and how many sources we would need to reach out to, because I knew that with the short timeline, we would most likely have a couple of people, a couple of plans fall through where we might be short on one particular source of information. So I'll come back a little bit to what we ended up solidifying for our content, because I do want to touch upon choosing the tools and technology as well as designing the interface. The interface of the Canvas, of course, is something that I think can be a little bit easy to overlook, especially when we're focused so much on creating quality learning objectives and creating good content and good assessments and things like that. But it is very important to create a solid plan for your interface, because that'll be the first thing that your trainees see when they get into your Canvas course or whatever learning management system you're using to conduct your training. So that involved a lot of careful design decisions, making sure that things were as accessibility friendly as possible, things like that. Regarding the tools and technology, this is something that, again, based on previous experience, we went back through a lot of the data we have to determine what tools were best suited to the types of learning tasks we wanted our learners to be able to do. Now, if I go down to this section here about prioritization, one thing that in the design process that I can't emphasize enough is that if you do have a team you're working with, delegating tasks when possible is very, very helpful and often necessary. Because I know for me, it was often easy for me to try to take on all of these things at once. But I did have, of course, my graduate assistant and then our team of PI associates to help with different things. So because of that, I was able to branch out content development and things like proofreading and usability testing to this wonderful team I have. And that really helped to make sure that I hadn't missed anything and that everything was as high quality as possible. Identifying the most relevant subject matter experts throughout the design process was also something we put a lot of planning into. We didn't have a lot of time to investigate as many subject matter experts as might have been ideal, but we did manage to find a few faculty representatives from departments who have high numbers of Category 5 TAs. And we were able to bring those individuals into a Zoom call and ask them, what do your TAs need to know in your classrooms? What kind of knowledge do they need? What resources should we give them? What skills do you want them to bring forward to the workplace? And that essentially is what sort of fed back into us designing the learning objectives and the assessments and things like that. Considering what the learners already know, as I mentioned, that we didn't want this training to be a complete reiteration of the standard training. We already knew things such as they had gone through that intensive policy training and basics of technology, of giving student feedback and different core teaching skills like that. So that helped us to figure out, okay, what can we cut from the curriculum for this short timeline and what can we focus on that they haven't gotten to learn as much about in the standard training. Avoiding reinventing the wheel was something that also helped us to keep moving forward in this process. We had many resources and colleagues who we were able to call upon to create new content, or in some cases repurpose other content that we had not used yet for the Category 5 TA role. Just to give a couple of examples, we reached out to colleagues at the Academic Center for Excellence. That is our tutoring center on campus, who we had worked with quite a lot before. A lot of the work that a Category 5 TA does is actually very similar to the peer tutoring that the ACE tutors do with undergraduate students. So because of that, we were able to talk to them and just find out what are their best practices for peers who are serving in an instructor or tutoring role. And we were able to then adapt that to the Category 5 TA content. Choosing tools and technologies carefully. This is something that I always like to go back to when we are designing some sort of new training or learning intervention.
Caity, this is Jim Klein. I'm not sure your slides are advancing in the way that you intend them to advance. I'm still seeing a very early slide. I don't know if anybody else is.
Can you all see the slide that says design phase and prioritization?
Yes.
Okay, so we should be on this final, well, the animations may have lagged there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
No problem.
I see the, right.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the technology acceptance model is something that you might study if you ever go into classes about mobile learning and different concepts pertaining to that. And essentially, it is the idea that the successful implementation of a particular tool or piece of technology depends on the learner's perceived usefulness of that technology. So are they going to look at the technology and see it as helping them to achieve their goals or the task that they want to complete? And their perceived ease of use of that technology. So do they see themselves as actually being able to learn that technology in a timely fashion? And will it interfere with them actually being able to learn the content? So this is something we always consider whenever we are determining what tools we want to use within a training intervention. Because again, we don't want the tool to be too complex for what the trainees actually need to achieve. We want to make sure that we can fully support them with tech support resources and things such as accessibility statements, ensuring that the tool is as accessibility friendly as possible. So these are all things that we make sure that we consider carefully throughout the design phase. And whenever you do find yourself in doubt about what you want to design and what your priorities should be, I would suggest always going back to your analysis. Any notes that you have from that data you've gathered during the analysis phase can really help you to make a decision on, whether you want to implement a certain thing or whether or not you should go with a different design decision. All right, so moving on to development, this is where we really started getting into the creative sides of things and actually building that content for the training. So the first thing we did as we were closing out the design stage is we reached out to all of these colleagues and collaborators to start getting the content built. And the way we did this is we immediately explained what our needs were, what the project entailed, specifications of what the learners would need to take away from the content, the timeline, and of course, I always do like to add what are some benefits for assisting with this type of project, since we wouldn't be able to give anyone any sort of monetary compensation. We would focus on things such as this is an opportunity to network with other graduate students and to get them interested in your own programming. This is also something that you can put on your CV or resume, that it is a university-wide required training that you were able to contribute content toward. But listing those needs and guidelines was very important and very helpful for the content creators, because then they knew exactly what we needed and exactly what specifications we needed for the content. In addition to talking to our collaborators, we also built a lot of content that were in line with Creative Commons rules. Specifically, we used open educational resources, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But that was something that, again, helped us to avoid reinventing the wheel. We were able to take and adapt content that colleagues that we already had to assist us with this project so that we could create that high quality content. Regarding interface development, we of course used Canvas, and mainly we focused on the organization of all of the content within the Canvas shell. That's something that can easily create a distraction and decrease the ineffectiveness of your training, as if the organization is not there. So we spent a lot of time creating modules, determining what the best flow would be for all of the content and all of the topics within that learning management system. We also spent time creating very precise instructions to make sure that trainees always knew what the expectations were, what guidelines they needed to follow, and what the timeline was for completion. And then, of course, in the development phase, we finalized all of our assessments. We ensured that they flowed well, that the questions were good. We removed any questions that were flawed or confusing after testing them a little bit. And this sort of wrapped up our early development of the training. Now, a few other considerations that I would like to point out. If you do find yourself in a situation where you have all this really cool content that you want to include in your training, but maybe you don't have quite enough time to make it fit into the training program, or maybe your trainees might not have quite enough time to sift through all of the content. One thing you can consider is including optional supplemental materials as needed. So one thing that we always have in these Canvas training courses is we have our required materials that are marked as required in the modules, and then we have a section of optional supplemental materials that the trainees can go over at their own leisure if they want to learn a little bit more about each topic. So that's something that can be really fun and helpful for further professional development, but it won't impede them being able to complete the training program on time. Now, going back to open educational resources, if anyone is unfamiliar with the concept of OER, To provide a very, very simple explanation and definition of OER, they are resources for education that have had many different constraints removed, often licensing. You will see a lot of OER that are licensed under a Creative Commons license. So they are a bit more accessible, and instructors are typically able to adapt them more to fit whatever their teaching needs are. Oftentimes they can have other constraints moved, such as some of them are very low cost or free of cost for educators to access or for learners to access if it is a course that a learner is interested in taking. And sometimes they also have, shorter timelines for completion, things like that. So for our purposes, I've included a screenshot on the screen here that says Explore, Create, Collaborate. This is a very helpful database called OER Commons. You can see the definition on the screenshot here, that it is a public digital library of OER. And essentially, this type of database that contains all these resources, you can type in the specific topic you're looking for. You can set it by educational level. So typically when I am adapting open educational resources, I focus on the graduate level or on the professional level, things like that. And then the database will, based on your search criteria, pull forward many different types of resources pertaining to that topic. So you might find readings, you might find lesson plans, videos, all different types of helpful materials that, depending on the license used, you can typically take those and adapt them to your own purposes. So OER honestly was something that made this project possible in such a short timeline. It is a very, very powerful tool for creating content. One thing that I would definitely suggest when you're creating really any type of training within any platform is if you have an opportunity to use a sandbox space. So in this case, we have Canvas development courses that as staff and instructors were able to request those and play around with them a little bit. Those are very helpful when you are trying new things, new tools, new techniques for your learners by using all these different options within Canvas without actually risking messing up the real course that your students will be enrolled in. So that's something that you may find very helpful if you are ever designing training with using a learning management system, is using that sandbox space to practice and to kind of work out some of the bugs with your tools. Additionally, for this training in particular, we did focus less on the quantity of the materials within the course and more on the quality. So we had multiple mediums for the content throughout the course, which taps into universal design for learning. That's the idea, of course, that different learners have different preferences for how they learn most efficiently. And some learners may have different accessibility needs for how they learn and absorb content. So to achieve that, we focused on minimal core topics, and we provided content to cover those topics in many different forms, such as readings, videos, we had podcasts, and then of course we added those supplemental materials just in case the trainees wanted a few more modality options for how they learned the content. We also ensured that we provided tools to enhance accessibility. Canvas has a very helpful accessibility tool now called Blackboard Ally that will automatically tell you how accessible your content is, and if it's not accessible, what steps do you take to increase that accessibility? So that's something, if you ever want to learn more about that, I highly recommend going to the Office of Distance Learning and going through their training courses and workshops on that. All right, so moving on to implementation and evaluation. These sort of came very close together. For the implementation phase, we finalized all of the instructions within the training. This is very important to make sure that there are no gray areas. Your trainees know exactly what they need to do and exactly what the expectations are. We created and uploaded various support contacts and how-to guides, especially for the technology you use in your course. It's very helpful to make sure they know how to access Canvas support. If you're doing Zoom training, making sure they can access Zoom support, things like that. Preparing announcements and first step instructions. This is something that I always like to do with online training specifically because there can be a little bit of an isolating feeling when your trainees have never met you in person and then they go into an online course. So we always make sure that we post welcome videos to let them know, congratulations for achieving this TA position and that, who we are and how we can help you even beyond the training. And also, of course, letting them know what their first steps are, because it can be very overwhelming going into a new training course for the first time. And just letting them know where to get started can help your users a lot with successfully navigating the training course. Our GA was tremendously helpful for conducting the final proofread, because I've found that sometimes you can get to where you're looking at your content for so long that you don't notice what is a glaring typo in the middle of all of the text. So having someone else being able to proofread that is really helpful and can save a lot of mistakes. We also have a whole process for registration data and actually launching the site and getting it to our target audience. And the reason I say on this slide, don't forget the logistics, is because when you, of course, get enraptured in creating all this cool content and designing and launching the training, it can be easy to forget about, okay, how are trainees going to actually register for this training? How are they going to hear about it? How are they going to enroll in the training later on? So that's something that we made sure we went through a clear registration process with thorough instructions so that the trainees knew exactly what to do and how to access this content. So after the first launch, I, of course, made myself as available as possible via email so that if there were any immediate bugs or problems with the training, they could contact me and I could get them resolved very, very quickly. In subsequent iterations of the training, this has not been as necessary since we've gone through and fixed a lot of the early bugs and problems that occurred. But definitely for your first launch, I think it is very important to make sure you're paying attention to how things are going and if there are any problems that you might not have been aware of. We then, once the training was complete, entered into our evaluation phase. And we had already selected the tool for evaluation, which of course was Qualtrics. We designed our evaluation items very carefully using a combination of Likert scale items where people could give numeric ratings for how much they liked the training and how different specific areas they thought were particularly good or needed improvement. We also gave them text box questions so that they could go in and give us very specific textual feedback explaining why they had rated the training a specific way. Those, for me personally, are the most helpful types of evaluation items, because then I can see if there are any patterns, if there are specific things that trainees are having problems with and would like to see improved in the future. We also created thorough instructions, again, for how the audience was being asked to complete the evaluation. We determined our ideal launch time to yield the highest number of complete evaluation forms. For us, it usually tends to be about 2 weeks after the trainees have completed the training, because at that point, they know that they are fully certified to be a TA, and the evaluation form tends not to get quite as lost in the many emails that they will likely be managing. And then, of course, we go through our waiting period of watching the evaluations come in. And once we have all of those, we analyze the results in preparation for our next iteration of the training. Now, a few quick notes on analyzing and using audience feedback. It can be very, very challenging to gather a substantial sample when, like in our case, it's not required for the audience to fill out the evaluation form. A few things that I think help are letting them know that it is anonymous, so they can be completely honest about how they felt about the training. Circulating it multiple times. Sometimes people do want to fill out the evaluation form, but it gets lost in their inbox. So if you send it to them more than once, this can help with that. And then also making sure that you do implement some of the suggestions from your trainees. I know this probably seems like something that's fairly obvious, but I think that when you start to build a reputation in your instructional design practice, that you listen to your learners and you implement some of their suggestions for improvement, it can have a really good effect on them being more willing to give you honest, helpful feedback. So during feedback analysis, a few things that I would like to point out. One is that it's okay to be nervous. Every time I go through a new round of feedback, I still find myself getting a little bit nervous. You most likely will not be able to please everyone. I wanted to share this top screenshot because it's honestly kind of funny. This was somebody who did not want to go through the training at all, completely anonymous results, but this is something where, you know, no matter what you do, this particular learner likely would not have liked the training. But if you keep going through your results, you will find people who generally, you know, they liked specific aspects of the training. They want to see other things expanded upon more. They'll give you really helpful feedback for how you can make it better in areas where it didn't work as well as you might have wanted it to. This second screenshot, I think, is a good example of that. The trainee really enjoyed all of the quizzes in the course, but they wanted to have a clearer list of to-dos at the beginning of the course to let them know exactly what was expected and what specific tasks they needed to do by the deadline. As you're going through your feedback, if you do find yourself feeling a little bit defensive, which definitely happens, especially if your trainees don't like a particular part of the training that you put a lot of work into, it can be helpful to take a break, go work on something else for a little while, and then come back to it and ask, why was a specific design decision made? Is it necessary that we run the training this way with this particular element? If so, why is it necessary? Can we tweak it in a particular way? If it isn't necessary, then what can we change? How can we make it better based on our trainees' feedback? Always asking why and reflecting on these decisions and on how they might need to change in the future, I think really helps us to keep making our training better and better throughout multiple iterations. So this is a quick example that I will briefly highlight about essentially an emergency instructional design project that we created. This came about in spring 2020 when the university was about to close down for the pandemic. Many courses transitioned online for the very first time at FSU. And we had, I believe, 1 day to organize an essentially emergency training to get as many TAs as possible oriented to the online teaching process. Now, this, of course, is not your typical instructional design project. So we really did have to consider our priorities very quickly. So we focused on bringing in an expert facilitator from the Office of Distance Learning to talk about these different aspects of online instruction. We, of course, had to focus on ensuring that the room was safe for major safety guidelines. Those are some of those important logistics that can be easy to forget, particularly when you are managing in-person training. We emphasize specific learning outcomes, such as asking the facilitator to demonstrate these broadly applicable tools and techniques to the audience, and also emphasizing what was essentially a triage approach to online learning versus ideal, because again, this was the first time that many of these courses had to be very quickly transitioned online. So it wasn't going to be the ideal type of instruction we want to see in high quality online classes. So because of that, we also ensured that all of the materials that we gave our TAs were job aids as opposed to workshop activities. And when we gave them evaluation at the end, we gauged what they still needed even after they engaged with this very quick emergency training. All of this was to help ensure that even beyond this specific emergency, very quickly designed training session to help with this situation, we could still continue supporting them, continue fulfilling those needs, reflecting on what they still needed, what this particular training act lacked, and then fulfilling that with future events and resources and services. So these are just a few major takeaways from some of these examples today. Again, the ADDIE process was helpful not only for helping me to organize how I would explain these major projects today, but for keeping you on track, especially when you do have constraints that you're dealing with your instructional design projects. It helps you to figure those things out ASAP and to prioritize what you really need in your training. Avoiding reinventing the wheel when possible. So reaching out to your colleagues and collaborators to help with content, and also utilizing OER as a powerful resource can be really helpful for creating new training content. Collecting as much feedback as possible, not only from the evaluations that you have delivered to your trainees, but also you may find your trainees come up to you afterward or email you and let you know that they liked certain things about the training or certain things that can be improved. Those are all helpful things to note down and reflect upon for future iterations. Also being aware of design decision biases. Like I said, if you do find yourself getting defensive while going through evaluation feedback, it can be helpful to ask yourself those questions. You know, why did we make a particular design decision? Can we improve it? What can we do to make it function better for our learners? And then during times of emergencies, such as the example I gave in the previous slide, really focusing on those major logistics and takeaways can help a lot. And then, of course, being there as a support system for further professional development and education can be really helpful for your learners. These are just a few tips on when something does go wrong, because sometimes we can't possibly plan for everything. Things such as having backup plans and testing your technology are really helpful preventative measures, but also doing things such as pausing and taking a break, avoiding rushing to a solution, instead thinking it through systematically, thinking through all of the aspects that you need to consider and how they will be affected if you make a certain decision or a change in one area. How is that going to affect all other processes in your training? If you have a team, using them and delegating things to them to make sure that you're not taking on everything all at once by yourself is really helpful. And I really liked this image that I have on the slide here, reflecting on different mistakes that can occur in the instructional design process. These questions are very helpful. Was the plan appropriate? Was the intention appropriate? What led to the mistake, etc.? And reflecting on these can help you to identify not only why it happened, but how we can prevent similar design flaws and mistakes from happening again in the future. So, what can Pi do for you at this point? I do want to share, if I can find it here at the end of my slide, a quick Padlet link. I'm going to stop my share for just a moment. As I mentioned, sort of close to the beginning of the presentation today, Pi offers many services such as the peer teaching observations, and we also have a newsletter that shares different pedagogical tips with our instructors and other TAs at FSU. We also have things like a book club for further professional development, and of course those teaching workshops I mentioned at the beginning. All of these are things that are designed to help enrich your experience as an educator, as a full-time instructor, and even in some cases as an instructional designer. We do have some topics that are specifically catered to instructional design. So in the chat, I have linked a Padlet to all of you. There are instructions for how exactly to use it within the Padlet site. And you can use that to go through and let us know some of the things that you would like to see Pi offer. If you have any ideas for workshop topics you'd like to see from us, you can suggest those and we will come back and analyze those later and determine how we can fulfill those needs. Additionally, if you have any questions and you don't want to unmute your microphone, that's perfectly fine. You can ask those in the Padlet as well. But without further ado, I see I am right at 1 o'clock, so please feel free to fill out the Padlet. If you do have questions, I can get back to you on those. And additionally, I can stay around for a few minutes if you have anything else for me. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here today.
Thank you very much, Caity. And I just want to let everybody know that Caity's willing to stay around at the end if you have questions. But before we say goodbye to the rest of you, would like you to consider putting February 25th on your calendar. That's the last Friday in the month of February at noon. We will have an ASKe seminar on that day that will be offered by some of our doctoral graduates of our program, Doctors Logan Arrington, Allison Moore, and Jeff Phillips. And they're going to be talking about the recent updates to the instructional design and technology trends database that was first developed by Dr. Reeser, and I believe both Jeff, Dr. Phillips, and Dr. Reeser are on the call today. And so you get a chance to see this trends database and how you can use it in your teaching, as well as how you can use it to keep your own professional knowledge up to date. Jeff, is there anything you'd like to add about that?
Additionally, it serves as like a collaborative technology, so you can also add entries to it. So you're not just a user, you're also a contributor, or I guess a producer. I mispronounce that all the time. If Dr. Dennon was here, she would correct my use.
Thank you, Jeff. Dr. Reeser, anything you'd like to add about the instructional technology and design trends database? Somebody needs to poke Dr.
Yes,
Reeser.
I hear you.
There he is.
So rather than talking about that, I just want to tell Caity and what a great job she did. It's always refreshing to see someone using the ID model in an appropriate way. And I think that serves as a great example of how to do that. I have to run to another meeting, but thanks very much, Caity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caity. Are there questions or comments for Caity that you would like to add? I know we're over time.
You can also feel free to put them in the Padlet and I will check those later, and I'm happy to get back to anybody via email who has any questions but needs to go.
Okay,
Yeah, I have a quick one.
It is, yeah, please go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm super, thank you for your presentation. I'm super excited that you implement OER, especially teaching like the Category 5 TAs. What advantages do you see in introducing them to OER as opposed to them just using like a book from Pearson that has like the questions and stuff in there already?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you. So this is actually something that we hold regular workshops on in conjunction with some of our colleagues at FSU libraries to teach our TAs about the advantages of implementing OER. And I think one thing is that like I mentioned, one of the main advantages of OER is that so many of the constraints are removed. So they have more freedom for how can they adapt it and transform it to fit exactly what their instructional goal is. And that was something that we used actually with teaching our TAs about effective communication. A lot of the tips within the OER reading that I adapted were perfect, but they mentioned specific audience types that were not the Category 5 TAs, but because of how it was licensed, I was able to go in very easily, edit the content, and then of course, write about the edits in the attribution section. But that's one thing, is that they have a lot more freedom for how they are permitted to adapt and change it to their specific instructional needs. And then of course, another is that I know with Pearson, sometimes you have to use things like access codes, which then the students are typically unhappy about having to pay a lot of money for those. And in OER, you typically don't see those types of constraints. So those are, I guess, to sort of sum all of that up, they're a little bit more accessible to everyone, and they are also much easier to adapt to very specific learning situations.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I've seen the big experiences. You can put the chapters in whatever order you want. They don't have to jump around. And then a quick follow-up, do you ever like teach them about like open pedagogy, like, you know, creating assignments where they get to keep continuing throughout semesters?
Yes, definitely. That is actually another part of the workshops that we often bring in. It's not only about OER, it's also about open pedagogy. So we also encourage TAs that whenever they are able to create those types of assignments and projects in their courses that carry on, it's something that is not just confined to one specific iteration of that course. They can keep building upon it in the future, and the students they really intend to enjoy that a lot and get a lot of fulfillment out of it. I think it is a lot of work for the TAs and the instructor of record to put all of the planning and designing into those types of projects, but just encouraging them that it is possible if they can start planning and implementing those types of things into their curriculum, I think is something we try to do. And we also let them know that we're there to support them if they do want to take on that type of project.
Caity, there was a question in the chat about your using once they go through the training, that these folks are then able to be assessed on their performance or evaluated on their performance now that they go back to their teaching assignments. So what are you doing in that regard, or how do you think that could be done?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that aspect does tend to be dependent on the departments who release the evaluation forms for their TAs in each classroom. However, there are a couple of things that we do within PI in terms of evaluating and then implementing performance improvement for our TAs. We have our PI associates who are able to essentially inform us about what are the gaps within their particular department. And they do this actually by launching a needs assessment. We have a template of a needs assessment. We provide the PI associate, because typically they don't come in with instructional design knowledge. And then they go to their department, they assess the TAs, they look at feedback that the TAs have gotten over a certain amount of time. And then based on that, they determine what are the gaps in current performance and optimal performance that we're seeing in our specific department. Then based on that, the TA representatives who work with us, we sort of get together, we come up with a plan for how we are going to improve the TA performance. Sometimes it's through additional training and workshops on a particular topic. Other times it's by creating essentially a community of practice space where all of the TAs can get together and talk to each other and share expertise and materials. And sometimes they might need some job aids to take into their classroom. That's probably one of the biggest challenges, is that every department needs something very different. But by having these PI associates, these representatives from all these diverse departments come in and talk to us about what is needed in terms of performance improvement, that's really, I think, our best way of improving the TAs even after they go through training. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you very much. I think it did. So we are 10 minutes over time. So again, I'd like to thank Caity for making this presentation today. And for those of you who stuck with it the whole time and you're still here, because I know some people left at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much. And as always, Demetrius, thank you for your service to the program and to the ASKe community. So with that, we're going to say goodbye, and we'll all sign off until next time.
Thank you, everybody.